Have you ever wondered what happens when the most silenced voice in a room suddenly becomes the loudest truth anyone has ever heard? When a young girl, no older than 15, stands barefoot on cold wooden floors in the heart of a Mississippi plantation, commanded to entertain guests who see her as nothing more than property. What kind of song could possibly escape from such a fractured soul? Tonight, I'm going to tell you about temperance. Her name meant moderation, restraint, self-control, everything the institution of slavery tried to impose upon her spirit. But what poured from her lips on that fateful December evening in 1847 was anything but restrained. It was raw, unfiltered. A hymn that carried the weight of every lash, every separation, every stolen child and broken promise. If you've been searching for stories that cut through the comfortable lies history sometimes tells us, you've found the right place. Hit that subscribe button right now, because what you're about to discover will reshape how you understand courage, faith, and the unstoppable power of the human voice. This isn't just history, this is a reckoning that still echoes in our bones today. Stay with me until the very end, because the final moments of Temperance's story contain a revelation that scholars have debated for over a century. What really happened after those tears dried? Let's find out together. Today, if you drive along Highway 61 through the Mississippi Delta, past the endless cotton fields that stretch toward horizons stained with industrial smoke and forgotten promises, you might miss it entirely. A rusted iron gate, half swallowed by kudzu vines, marks the entrance to what remains of Bellefleur plantation. The main house collapsed decades ago, termites and time conspiring with something darker to erase its grandeur. But the locals will tell you, if you catch them in the right mood and the hour grows late enough, that the land itself refuses to forget. On certain winter nights, when the fog rolls thick off the Yazoo River and wraps around the ancient oaks like burial shrouds, people claim to hear singing. Not the casual hum of radio static or the mechanical drone of farm equipment. No, this is something older, something that vibrates in your chest before it reaches your ears. A hymn. Always the same one, rising from the exact spot where the slave quarters once stood, now marked only by a depression in the earth and a few scattered bricks the color of dried blood. The Beaumont family built Bellefleur in 1798, when Mississippi was still a territory, and cotton had not yet become the tyrannical king it would grow to be. 3 generations of Beaumonts expanded the estate until it sprawled across 4,000 acres, a private empire maintained by the forced labor of over 200 enslaved men, women, and children. The original plantation house boasted 16 rooms, each decorated with furniture imported from France, wallpaper from England, and chandeliers from Venice. Crystal and cruelty coexisted under the same roof. Silk curtains drawn tight against windows to keep out the Mississippi heat also muffled the sounds that drifted up from the fields. Sounds no amount of European refinement could truly silence. By 1847, the estate belonged to Cornelius Beaumont III, a man whose reputation for hospitality among the planter class was matched only by whispered accounts of his brutality. His wife, Adelaide, prided herself on maintaining what she called the most civilized household between Natchez and Memphis. She collected fine porcelain, wrote mediocre poetry about magnolias, and believed herself a benevolent mistress, a delusion that allowed her to sleep peacefully in her feathered bed while human beings suffered unimaginable degradations mere yards from her window. It was Adelaide who first noticed the voice. It was Adelaide who decided to cultivate it. And it was Adelaide whose tears would stain the imported Persian carpet on that December night, when everything she believed about her world, and herself, came crashing down around her. This is not merely a story about a song. It is an excavation of the moment when the machinery of dehumanization encountered something it could not process, could not control, could not survive. A moment when the comfortable narratives of the antebellum South collided with a truth so pure it burned. If you want to accompany more cases like this one, stories that shake the very foundations of what we think we know and reveal hidden truths, subscribe to this channel so you don't miss any investigation. Bellefleur Plantation operated like a small, self-contained kingdom, one built entirely on the systematic extraction of human life and labor. Understanding Temperance's story requires understanding the world into which she was born, A world designed with terrible precision to crush the spirit while preserving the body as a productive instrument. The slave quarters at Bellefleur consisted of 23 cabins arranged in 2 parallel rows, separated by a dirt path that turned to mud in the rainy season and hardened to rutted concrete during the brutal summer months. Each cabin measured approximately 14 feet by 16 feet and housed anywhere from 8 to 12 people, depending on the season and the plantation's needs. The structures were built from rough-hewn cypress planks, chinked with mud and moss that provided inadequate protection against both the suffocating summer heat and the damp winter cold. A single door faced the main house, a deliberate architectural choice that allowed overseers to monitor movement at all hours. There were no windows. The work bell rang at 4:30 in the morning. Before the sun had even hinted at the eastern horizon, before the mockingbirds had begun their daily performances, the enslaved population of Bellefleur was expected to be assembled in the main yard for roll call. The head overseer, a man named Josiah Crenshaw, whose pale eyes seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, would walk down the lines, leather whip coiled at his side like a sleeping serpent. He counted bodies the way a merchant counts inventory. Any absence, any delay, any perceived disrespect was met with immediate and public punishment. From roll call until sunset, and often beyond during harvest season, the work continued without meaningful rest. Field hands picked cotton until their fingers bled, then wrapped their wounds in rags and continued picking. The quota was 200 pounds per day. Those who fell short faced the lash. Those who exceeded it found their quota increased the following day. The system was designed to extract maximum labor while providing minimum sustenance, a calculation of human suffering reduced to cold arithmetic. But the fields were only part of the horror. The domestic sphere, which Adelaide Beaumont considered her personal domain, operated according to its own cruel logic. House slaves were expected to be invisible presences, silently anticipating needs, enduring humiliations with expressionless faces, absorbing the casual violence of their owners as if it were as natural as breathing. They dressed their mistresses, bathed the children of their captors, cooked food they were forbidden to eat, and maintained an elaborate performance of subservience that Adelaide interpreted as genuine affection and gratitude. The punishment for house slaves who displeased their masters was often worse than anything that happened in the fields. Cornelius Beaumont kept a small building behind the stables that everyone on the plantation knew simply as the correction room. What happened inside those walls was never discussed openly. But the screams that occasionally drifted across the evening air, the way certain people emerged days later unable to meet anyone's eyes, the unexplained absences from the kitchen or the laundry, these spoke a language that required no translation. The sound that dominated Bellefleur was not the singing of birds or the rustle of cotton in the breeze. It was the crack of the whip, sharp and irregular, punctuating the thick delta air like lightning strikes in a storm that never ended. It was the clanking of chains when coffles of newly purchased human beings arrived from the auction blocks in Natchez. It was the wailing of mothers separated from their children, sold off to settle debts or satisfy whims. It was the enforced silence of the dining room, broken only by the clink of silver against porcelain, while invisible hands served invisible people. And beneath all these sounds, barely audible, persistent as a heartbeat, there was humming. In the cabins after dark, when exhaustion had claimed the body but could not entirely conquer the spirit. In the fields when overseers were distant. In the kitchen when Adelaide's attention was elsewhere. Songs without words, melodies passed down through generations, carrying coded messages of resistance and remembrance. The Beaumonts heard this humming and considered it evidence of contentment. They could not have been more wrong. Into this world, in the year 1832, a child was born. Her mother, Esther, was a field hand who had been purchased 3 years earlier from a failing tobacco plantation in Virginia. The pregnancy was not welcome. Cornelius Beaumont's father, the second of his name, briefly considered selling Esther before she could give birth. Pregnant women were considered poor investments, their labor capacity temporarily diminished. But something stayed his hand. Perhaps he sensed the value of the child yet to come. Perhaps he simply forgot. History does not record his reasoning, only his decision. The birth took place in Esther's cabin on an August night so hot that even the mosquitoes seemed to have surrendered. An elderly woman named Nana Ruth, who served as midwife for the entire enslaved community, delivered the baby by candlelight. The child emerged small but alert, with eyes that seemed to take in everything, cataloging the world into which she had been so cruelly thrust. Esther named her Temperance, a name she had heard from a traveling preacher who had passed through the plantation years before, spreading a gospel of patience and delayed reward. Temperance meant self-control. It meant waiting for divine justice. It meant surviving. The name would prove both prophecy and paradox. For the first 5 years of her life, Temperance existed in the precarious space between the big house and the fields. Too young for hard labor, she was assigned to the nursery, where she helped care for the youngest enslaved children while their parents worked. It was here, in this liminal space, that she first discovered her voice. The nursery was supervised by an ancient woman called Auntie Mabel, whose exact age no one knew because time itself seemed to have given up trying to claim her. Mabel had been born in Africa. She still remembered the songs of her village, though she had been stolen from it nearly 70 years before. To keep the children quiet and occupied, Mabel sang. She sang work songs and play songs, spirituals and lullabies, songs in languages that existed nowhere else on American soil, because everyone who once spoke them had died or been scattered to the winds. Temperance absorbed these songs the way dry earth absorbs rain. By the time she was 4, she could reproduce any melody after hearing it once. By 5, she was harmonizing, adding notes Mabel had never taught her, notes that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the confines of the nursery, beyond the borders of the plantation, beyond the limitations of the material world. That child got the gift, Mabel told Esther one evening, her voice low and weighted with significance. Ain't never heard nothing like it. Voice come from somewhere deep. You keep her close now. Them up at the house gonna hear about this. They always do. The warning came too late. Adelaide Beaumont had already heard. Adelaide had been passing by the nursery on an afternoon walk when the sound stopped her mid-stride. A child's voice, impossibly pure, rising above the general noise of the plantation like a single star piercing the twilight. She followed the sound to its source and stood outside the nursery window for nearly 15 minutes, transfixed. The girl was singing something Adelaide didn't recognize, not one of the approved hymns from the Episcopal Church, not one of the simple ditties Adelaide considered appropriate for enslaved children. Something older. Something that made Adelaide's spine tingle in a way she could not explain and did not particularly like. But the voice. That voice. Adelaide had studied music as a girl, had taken piano lessons from an instructor brought specially from Boston, had attended concerts in New Orleans and Charleston. She knew quality when she heard it. And what she heard from that nursery window was quality of a kind that transcended anything she had encountered in all her years among the planter aristocracy. Within a week, Temperance had been removed from the nursery and assigned to the main house as a personal attendant to Adelaide. She was 6 years old. The transition from nursery to big house was Temperance's first experience with the peculiar violence of proximity. In the fields, the cruelty was physical and overt. Whips and chains and backbreaking labor. In the house, it took subtler forms. She was cleaned up and dressed in a child-sized version of a domestic uniform. She was forbidden from speaking unless spoken to, forbidden from looking directly at white faces, forbidden from acknowledging her mother when she passed her in the yard. She was given a small pallet in a closet off Adelaide's dressing room, where she was expected to sleep ready to respond to her mistress's summonses at any hour. Adelaide considered herself a patient and progressive teacher. She instructed Temperance in the proper way to fold linens, arrange flowers, and pour tea without spilling. She taught her to walk without making noise, to anticipate needs before they were expressed, to become an extension of Adelaide's own will, and she took particular care with Temperance's musical education. "You have a gift," Adelaide told her one afternoon, the words landing on Temperance like a sentence rather than a compliment. A God-given gift. It would be sinful not to develop it. You will learn hymns, proper hymns, and you will sing them when I ask you to. Is that understood? Temperance nodded, having already learned that any response other than silent assent would be met with consequences. The lessons began. Adelaide would sit at her imported mahogany piano, picking out melodies with fingers that had never known rough labor, while Temperance stood beside her and sang. They worked through the Episcopal hymnal systematically. Amazing grace, rock of ages, a mighty fortress is our God. Adelaide corrected Temperance's pronunciation, insisted on proper diction, demanded that she strip from her voice any trace of the field songs and spirituals she had learned in the nursery. The goal was to create something Adelaide could display at her famous dinner parties, a performing slave whose voice would astonish her guests and reflect well on Adelaide's own refinement and taste. But Adelaide made a critical miscalculation. She taught Temperance the words. In the Episcopal hymnal, sanitized and approved by white churchmen, the language of suffering and redemption had been domesticated into comfortable metaphor. Amazing Grace was about spiritual salvation, not physical liberation. Go Down Moses had been excised entirely, its message deemed too inflammatory. The hymns Adelaide taught were designed to reinforce the divine order, to suggest that earthly suffering was merely a prelude to heavenly reward, to encourage patience rather than resistance. Temperance learned the words, but she heard something different in them. When she sang, "Were you there when they crucified my Lord?" she thought of Uncle Solomon, beaten to death for trying to escape the previous spring, his body left hanging as a warning for 3 days. When she sang, "Swing low, sweet chariot," she thought of the Underground Railroad, whispered about in the cabins at night as if it were a dream too precious to speak aloud. When she sang Amazing Grace, she heard not a celebration of submission but a cry for freedom. Was blind, but now I see, became an accusation against those who claimed not to see the horrors happening all around them. Adelaide noticed none of this. She heard only the voice, the technical perfection, the instrument she was crafting for her own entertainment. She remained blind. Years passed. Temperance grew from a child into a young woman, her voice maturing along with her body. By 15, she could perform for hours without tiring, could shift between registers with effortless precision, could make the crystal chandelier in the dining room vibrate sympathetically when she hit certain notes. Adelaide loaned her out for special occasions, neighboring planters' birthday celebrations, weddings, Christmas parties. Temperance became something of a local celebrity, though the fame brought her nothing but additional burdens. Through it all, she maintained 2 selves. There was the Temperance who performed for white audiences, whose voice delivered the approved hymns with mechanical perfection, whose eyes remained downcast and whose face showed nothing. And there was the other Temperance, who emerged only in the safety of the cabins at night, who taught the children the old songs Mabel had taught her, who added new verses to spirituals that encoded maps and instructions for escape, whose voice carried not entertainment, but revolution. This double life required constant vigilance. A single slip, a moment's transparency, could mean disaster. Temperance watched other enslaved people punished for far less, for glancing too long at a book, for humming the wrong melody, for any behavior that suggested interiority, thoughts beyond their assigned role. She learned to compress her true self into smaller and smaller spaces, hiding it deep where no white eyes could penetrate. But compression has limits, and something was building inside her that could not be contained forever. Leave in the comments, never give up on truth if you believe that justice should reach all the oppressed. The year 1847 brought changes to Bellefleur plantation that would set the stage for what came next. In March, Cornelius Beaumont II died of a stroke, leaving his son sole master of the estate. Cornelius III was 34 years old, married 8 years to Adelaide, and already showing signs of the brutal efficiency that would define his reign. His first act as undisputed master was to sell 17 enslaved people, families deliberately separated, children torn from parents, to pay off gambling debts his father had accumulated in the final years of his life. Among those sold was Esther, Temperance's mother. The sale happened on a Tuesday morning in April, under a sky so blue it seemed to mock the proceedings below. Temperance was not permitted to attend the auction itself, but she watched from an upstairs window as her mother was led away in a coffle with 16 others chained at the neck, marching toward a fate about which Temperance could only have nightmares. Esther turned once just before she disappeared from view, and their eyes met across the distance. No words, no gestures. Just that look, carrying everything that could not be said. Temperance did not cry. She had learned that crying was a luxury she could not afford, that tears invited attention and attention invited punishment. She stood at that window long after the coffle had vanished down the road to Natchez, her face expressionless, her hands clenched at her sides. When Adelaide called for her an hour later, she answered with the same meek efficiency she always displayed. Only Mabel, watching from the kitchen, saw something different in her eyes. Something hard. Something final. "It's setting in now," Mabel whispered to herself, crossing her arms over her chest. "Lord have mercy. It's setting in." Throughout the spring and summer, Temperance continued her duties without outward change. She dressed Adelaide, served at dinner parties, sang her hymns on command. But something had shifted in the frequency of her voice, something the white listeners could not detect, but the enslaved community heard clearly. When she sang, "Nobody knows the trouble I've seen," they heard not resignation but documentation, a recording of every atrocity, every injustice, every unremarked death. When she sang "Steal Away," they heard not metaphor but instruction. In the cabins at night, Temperance began teaching a new song. No one knew where it came from. Some said she composed it herself, others claimed it came to her in a dream. Still others believed it was an ancient melody that had traveled across the ocean in the holds of slave ships, waiting for the right voice to give it form. The song had no name. It was simply called The Hymn. Its words were about heaven, about angels, about peaceful rest. But its structure contained something else, a series of tonal patterns that, when sung in the right sequence, created what we might today call a subliminal message. The conscious mind heard a conventional spiritual. Something deeper heard a call to awakening. Whether Temperance understood what she was doing is impossible to say. Perhaps she was simply channeling forces beyond her own comprehension. Perhaps she had made a deliberate study of the psychology of her oppressors and discovered exactly how to bypass their defenses. Perhaps grief had unlocked something that had always been latent within her, waiting for the right catalyst to emerge. Whatever the source, the hymn spread. By September, it was being sung in cabins across the Yazoo Delta. By October, reports of a strange new spiritual had reached the attention of planters as far away as Vicksburg and Memphis. By November, preachers were warning their congregations about the dangers of allowing slaves too much musical freedom. Something was in the air, something that made the comfortable uncomfortable and the powerful uneasy. And then came the invitation. Adelaide Beaumont had been planning her Christmas party for months. It was to be the social event of the season, a demonstration of the Beaumont family's wealth, taste, and position at the apex of Delta society. Guests were invited from as far as New Orleans and Charleston. The menu featured delicacies imported from Europe. The decorations included a 12-foot Christmas tree, still a novelty in that era, shipped at great expense from the mountains of Virginia. And the entertainment, of course, would feature Temperance. Adelaide spent weeks selecting the program. She chose hymns that showcased Temperance's range, while remaining properly festive and not overly emotional. She disliked when her slave performances became too intense, preferring her entertainment to remain safely ornamental. The guests were to enjoy the voice as they might enjoy a fine wine or a beautiful painting, with aesthetic appreciation unmarred by messy feeling. She did not consult Temperance about the program. It never occurred to her to do so. Temperance was an instrument after all. One does not ask a piano which pieces it prefers to play. The party was scheduled for December 23, 1847. 112 guests accepted the invitation. The weather cooperated, providing a clear, cold night that made the fires burning in every hearth seem especially welcoming. Carriages lined the drive from the main road to the house, their occupants disgorging in clouds of expensive perfume and moral bankruptcy. Inside, champagne flowed, conversation sparkled with the brittle wit of the planter class, and everyone agreed that Adelaide had truly outdone herself this time. At 9 o'clock, Adelaide called for quiet. The entertainment was about to begin. Temperance was brought out in a white dress Adelaide had selected for the occasion, an uncomfortable irony that was lost on everyone in the room except its wearer. She stood before the assembled guests, 112 faces staring at her expectantly, waiting to be amused by her talent, seeing in her not a person, but a curiosity, a testament to their hostess's excellent training. Adelaide sat at the piano. "We'll begin with Silent Night," she announced to the room. Then, Joy to the World. And finally, something special. Temperance will conclude with Amazing Grace, which she sings quite beautifully. She played the opening notes of Silent Night. Temperance opened her mouth, and nothing came out. Silence. The absence of expected sound. It stretched for seconds that felt like hours, during which Adelaide's fingers froze over the keys, and 112 pairs of eyes blinked in confusion. "Temperance," Adelaide's voice carried a warning. "Begin." Again, she played the introduction. Again, Temperance stood motionless, her mouth slightly open, no sound emerging. Was she frozen with stage fright? Had she suddenly been struck mute? The guests began to murmur among themselves, sensing something wrong, unsure what it might be. Adelaide felt heat rising to her face. This was impossible. This was humiliating. This was... "I'll sing," Temperance said. Her voice was soft, but it carried to every corner of the room. "But not those songs." The murmuring stopped. The silence that replaced it was of a different character, charged with anticipation and the first thin tendrils of fear. Adelaide's smile remained fixed on her face, but her eyes had gone cold. "What did you say?" "I said I'll sing, but I'll sing what I choose, what I need to sing, what you all need to hear." In the audience, Colonel James Worthington leaned toward his wife. "This is most irregular," he whispered. "Ought someone to intervene?" No one intervened. Perhaps they were too shocked. Perhaps some part of them, some buried fragment of conscience they had spent their lives suppressing, wanted to hear what would come next. Perhaps they sensed that something unprecedented was about to happen, and their curiosity outweighed their outrage. Temperance closed her eyes, and she began to sing. The hymn had no conventional beginning. It rose from silence like smoke from dying embers, so quietly at first that the audience had to strain to hear it. The melody was in a minor key, unusual for Christmas music, carrying with it an ache that seemed to have no source and no end. The words were familiar enough: "Wade in the water," a spiritual about baptism and salvation. But something in Temperance's interpretation transformed them. She sang of children. Children wading in water that was actually the tears of their mothers. Children crossing rivers not to find Jesus, but to find freedom. Children sold away from everything they had ever known, wading through waters of grief and terror, some of them drowning, some of them making it to distant shores where their names would be forgotten because no one was left alive who remembered them. The guests sat frozen. Adelaide's hands had fallen from the piano keys. In the corner of the room, elderly Mrs. Patterson, who had inherited 47 human beings from her late husband, felt something warm sliding down her cheek and raised a trembling hand to discover she was crying. Temperance's eyes remained closed. She had entered a space beyond the parlor, beyond the plantation, beyond the year 1847. Her voice was no longer simply her own. It channeled something collective, ancestral, reaching back through generations of silenced voices and giving them momentary form. She sang of the passage across the ocean. She sang of bodies thrown overboard to lighten ships caught in storms. She sang of the first terrible moment when African soil disappeared from view and nothing lay ahead but chains and cotton and an endless diminishment of the soul. The hymn shifted, modulated into something else. Now she was singing about Bellefleur itself, though not by name, about the crack of whips at dawn, about fingers bleeding in cotton fields, about the correction room behind the stables, about the things that happened there in darkness, about the men and women who emerged broken or did not emerge at all. She sang about mothers separated from children, her voice cracking for the first time on that word, children, and the guests heard in that crack the sound of something breaking that could never be repaired. In the audience, Henry Beaumont, Cornelius's cousin, a man who had personally overseen the sail that sent Esther to Natchez, rose suddenly from his chair and left the room. No one moved to stop him. No one even seemed to notice his departure. They were all held in the grip of something they could not name. The hymn continued. Temperance sang about resistance now, about those who refused to accept their enslavement, about Denmark Vesey and Nat Turner, names no one in that room had spoken aloud in years, names that still carried the power to make planters check the locks on their doors at night. She sang about the Underground Railroad, about stations and conductors and passengers making their way north by starlight, about the hundreds who had escaped and the thousands who dreamed of escaping. She sang about the day that was coming. She did not specify when, but everyone in that room understood what she meant, the day when the whole rotten edifice would come crashing down, when the ledgers would be balanced and the debts collected. By now, the weeping had spread. It was not just Mrs. Patterson. It was a dozen guests, 24, more. Men who had never shown emotion in public were wiping their eyes with silk handkerchiefs. Women who had spent their lives constructing elaborate defenses against moral feeling found those defenses crumbling. Something in Temperance's voice had penetrated beneath the surface, reaching parts of themselves they had buried so deep they had forgotten they existed. Adelaide sat at her piano bench with tears streaming down her face, her carefully constructed worldview collapsing around her like a house of cards in a hurricane. She had told herself stories about civilizing influences and Christian duty and benevolent care. She had genuinely believed in some compartmentalized chamber of her heart that she was a good person, that her slaves were fortunate to belong to her rather than to some harsher master. Now those stories evaporated like morning dew, and she saw herself clearly, perhaps for the first time in her life. She saw the monster she had become by participating in this system. She saw the blood on her hands, invisible but indelible. "Stop!" she tried to say, but her voice produced no sound. The hymn had stolen even that from her. Temperance opened her eyes. She looked directly at the audience, a violation of every rule she had been taught. And her gaze swept across the room like a searchlight, pausing on each face long enough to ensure they felt seen. She was no longer performing. She was witnessing. She was testifying. The final portion of the hymn was almost unbearable. She sang about forgiveness, not the easy forgiveness of Sunday sermons, the kind that costs nothing and changes nothing. This was forgiveness as confrontation, forgiveness as challenge, forgiveness that said, "I see what you have done, I name what you have done, and still, I am offering you a choice. You can remain what you are, or you can become something different. The decision is yours." And then it ended. The silence that followed was unlike any silence that had ever existed at Bellefleur Plantation. It was not the enforced silence of obedience. It was not the uncomfortable silence of social misstep. It was the silence of rupture, of fundamental change, of a world that had shifted on its axis and would never quite shift back. Temperance stood alone in the center of the room, surrounded by 111 weeping white faces, her own face dry, her hands steady at her sides. She had done what she came to do. Whatever happened next was beyond her control. If you watched this far, it's because you care about these stories that marked our country forever. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until here," so I can know who really cares about the search for historical truth. What happened immediately after remains somewhat unclear, the historical record fragmenting into conflicting accounts and deliberate silences. We know that the party ended abruptly. We know that guests departed in confusion and distress, many of them refusing to speak of the evening for years afterward. We know that Cornelius Beaumont, who had been absent during Temperance's performance, meeting with business associates in his study, emerged to find his wife in hysterics and his household in chaos. And we know that Temperance was taken to the correction room that night. The details of what transpired there are mercifully absent from the historical record. What we do know is that she emerged alive, which was itself unusual. Cornelius Beaumont was not known for mercy, and the offense Temperance had committed, public humiliation of his family before the assembled planter aristocracy, would typically have warranted the severest possible punishment. Some historians speculate that he was restrained by practical considerations. Temperance was valuable property, her voice an asset that had taken years to develop. Others suggest that even Cornelius was affected by something he heard about the performance, secondhand accounts that gave him pause. The most intriguing theory, supported by a single ambiguous entry in Adelaide's diary, is that Adelaide herself intervened. That something in Temperance's hymn had genuinely reached her, had cracked open the carapace of self-deception, and exposed the raw nerve of conscience beneath. That she begged her husband to spare Temperance's life, and that, perhaps for the first and only time in their marriage, he listened. Whatever the reason, Temperance survived. But she never sang again at Bellefleur. Adelaide never asked her to perform, never again sat at the piano to accompany her voice. Something had broken between them, or perhaps something had finally been acknowledged that had been broken from the beginning. Temperance was assigned to kitchen duties, removed from the proximity to the family that had defined her role for 9 years. She scrubbed pots, hauled water, kneaded bread. She spoke rarely and smiled never. The guests who had attended the Christmas party of 1847 scattered back to their own plantations, carrying with them the memory of what they had witnessed. Most tried to forget. Most succeeded, at least on the surface. But the hymn had planted seeds that would germinate in unexpected ways. In February 1848, Mrs. Patterson, the elderly widow who had been the first to weep, freed all 47 of her enslaved people in her will. She died 3 months later, and the will was contested by furious relatives, but the legal battle she initiated would tie up the courts for years and draw public attention to the moral questions she had finally been forced to confront. In March, Colonel Worthington, who had whispered about the irregularity of the performance, was overheard in a Natchez tavern saying that he had begun to wonder if the whole system wasn't rotten at its core. He was shunned by polite society and eventually relocated to California, where he became, improbably, an advocate for free soil. Throughout 1848 and 1849, similar small transformations occurred. A planter who began teaching his enslaved workers to read, despite the law. A plantation mistress who stopped using the whip and saw her cotton yields actually increase. A minister who preached a sermon questioning whether slavery was truly ordained by God and found himself expelled from his congregation, only to be welcomed by another congregation that had been waiting for exactly that message. None of these changes was dramatic enough to make headlines. None of them, individually, threatened the institution itself, but they were cracks in the foundation, and cracks have a tendency to spread. The hymn itself spread faster than any individual conversion. By the summer of 1848, it was being sung in slave quarters across the South. Not the same words Temperance had improvised, but adaptations, variations, call and response versions that could be customized for local conditions. Planters began to notice that their enslaved workers seemed different somehow, harder to read, less predictable. Something was passing between them that the masters could not intercept or interpret. In August 1848, a group of enslaved people at a plantation in Alabama staged a work stoppage, refusing to enter the fields until certain demands were met. When asked by the bewildered overseer what had prompted this action, one of the leaders reportedly said, "We heard a song that reminded us who we are." The work stoppage was eventually broken, its leaders punished severely, but it was followed by another incident in Georgia, then one in South Carolina, then a cluster of events in Mississippi that authorities scrambled to attribute to outside agitation, but could not quite explain away. Something was spreading, something that had the shape and sound of a hymn. Temperance remained at Bellefleur through all of this, unaware of the movement her single performance had helped catalyze. She worked in the kitchen. She kept her head down. She watched the seasons change through a window that faced away from the main house, toward the quarters where she had been born, where Mabel still lived and still taught the old songs to children who might, if they were lucky, live to see a different world. She did not sing. Not in public, not in the cabins, not even in the privacy of her own heart. The voice that had shaken a room full of slaveholders seemed to have retreated to some place beyond her reach. Perhaps it was healing. Perhaps it was preparing. Perhaps it was simply exhausted. In the autumn of 1850, news reached Bellefleur that would change everything once more. Esther, Temperance's mother, sold 3 years earlier, had died in a Louisiana sugarcane field. The details were vague. An accident, the letter said. An accident that could have been prevented, but wasn't. An accident that was really murder by another name. Temperance received this news while kneading bread in the kitchen, her hands coated with flour. The messenger, one of the house slaves, watched her face for a reaction, saw nothing visible, and withdrew. That night, in the kitchen, alone, Temperance began to hum. It was the first sound she had produced in nearly 3 years. The melody was simple at first, a half-remembered lullaby Esther used to sing, but it began to shift, to deepen, to take on weight and texture and meaning. By midnight, she was singing, softly but fully, and the song she sang was new. This was not the hymn that had broken the Christmas party. This was something darker, something more dangerous, a song not of witness but of reckoning, a song that did not ask white consciences to awaken but demanded that they answer for their crimes, a song that spoke of fire. No one heard it that night. No one recorded it. Whatever Temperance sang in the darkness of that empty kitchen, it remained her secret. But something was set in motion that could not be stopped. The years between 1850 and 1860 saw Bellefleur plantation decline. Cornelius Beaumont's business decisions grew increasingly erratic. The cotton harvests were poor, partly due to weather, partly due to what the overseers called a bad attitude among the hands that no amount of punishment seemed to correct. Adelaide withdrew into herself, rarely leaving her bedroom, consuming increasing quantities of laudanum to quiet the voices in her head that she insisted were echoes of a song she could not forget. Temperance continued her kitchen duties. She aged, as everyone ages, but those who knew her remarked that she seemed to be growing stronger rather than weaker with the passing years. There was something coiled in her bearing, something waiting. She still did not sing in public. But some nights, if you stood in the right place at the right hour, you could hear her humming. And if you were enslaved, if you were one of the community that knew how to listen, you understood what that humming meant. In 1859, news of John Brown's raid at Harper's Ferry reached Bellefleur. The enslaved population received the information through their own networks, faster than the newspapers could carry it to the big house. That night, Temperance sang again, not loudly, not publicly, but to a gathering of 20 trusted souls in the oldest cabin on the plantation. She sang of the old man who had tried to start a war, who had failed and been hanged for his failure, but whose failure was also a beginning. She sang of what was coming. "Won't be long now," she said, when the song was finished. "Won't be long." She was right. The Civil War began in April 1861. Mississippi seceded. Cornelius Beaumont enlisted as an officer in the Confederate Army, leaving the plantation in the hands of overseers who had neither his cruelty nor his competence. Adelaide died in the autumn of that year. The official cause was listed as fever, but everyone knew it was the laudanum, and everyone knew the laudanum was really the song, still echoing in her mind after all those years, inescapable and merciless. By 1863, the Union Army was advancing through Mississippi. Enslaved people throughout the region were fleeing to Union lines, claiming the freedom that the Emancipation Proclamation had promised. At Bellefleur, the exodus began in July. Families who had been held captive for generations gathered what belongings they could carry and walked off the land that had stolen so much from them. Temperance was among the last to leave. She was 41 years old, ancient by the standards of plantation labor, and she walked slowly, stopping often to look back at the place that had been her prison. When she reached the gate that marked the boundary of Beaumont land, she paused, and then, for the first time in over a decade, she sang in the open air. The hymn she sang that July morning was neither the one that had broken the Christmas party, nor the darker song of reckoning she had composed in the kitchen. It was something new. Something that contained elements of both but transcended them. A song of passage, a song of transformation, a song that marked an ending and a beginning. The other formerly enslaved people stopped to listen. Even Union soldiers encamped half a mile away fell silent, straining to hear the voice that drifted toward them on the summer wind. The song had no words that could be transcribed, no melody that could be written down in conventional notation. It existed only in that moment, in that voice, in the air between the singer and her audience. When it ended, Temperance stepped through the gate and did not look back again. The rest of Temperance's story is less well documented. We know she traveled north, eventually settling in Ohio, where a community of freed people had established itself. We know she worked as a cook, as a laundress, as whatever was necessary for survival. We know she joined a church, African Methodist Episcopal, and sang in its choir, though those who heard her say she sang differently than the others, with a quality that was difficult to describe but impossible to forget. She never married, she never had children of her own, but she became a mother to the community, raising generations of young people who learned from her not just songs, but ways of seeing, ways of remembering, ways of carrying forward what should not be forgotten. In 1870, a young white writer from New England traveled to Ohio to collect slave narratives for a book he was compiling. He sought out Temperance, having heard stories about her voice and wanting to interview her about her experiences. She agreed to speak with him, but on one condition: she would not discuss the Christmas party of 1847. "That was not for you," she told him. "That was for them, and it did what it needed to do." The writer pressed for details. What had she sung? What had the guests felt? What had been the consequences? Temperance shook her head. "Some things," she said, "are not meant to be written down. They're meant to be lived. They're meant to be passed on breath to breath, voice to voice, until they reach the ears that need to hear them. You write everything down, you think you're saving it, but really you're killing it, turning living sound into dead letters on a page." The writer included this exchange in his book, adding his own frustrated commentary about the irrationality of former slaves who refused to cooperate with the historical record. He did not understand, could not understand, that what Temperance was protecting was not information, but power. The hymn had worked because it had been unexpected, unprecedented, impossible to prepare for. If it became a story that everyone knew, it would lose its capacity to surprise. It would become nostalgia rather than revolution. Temperance died in 1891, at the age of 59, young by today's standards, but older than most who had endured what she endured. Her obituary in the local African-American newspaper described her as a pillar of the community, beloved by all who knew her, possessor of a voice that once moved mountains. It made no mention of Bellefleur, of Adelaide Beaumont, of a Christmas party interrupted by truth. But the hymn did not die with her. In the decades that followed, stories circulated through African-American communities about a song that had once made slaveholders weep. Details varied, names changed. Sometimes the singer was a young woman, sometimes an old woman, sometimes a child. Sometimes the plantation was in Mississippi, sometimes in Alabama, sometimes in Virginia. Sometimes the song led to freedom, sometimes to martyrdom, sometimes to both. The story was protean, adapting itself to the needs of each new telling, carrying forward the essential truth while discarding the merely factual. Scholars who have traced these oral traditions believe they all lead back to the same source. A December evening in 1847, a 15-year-old girl named Temperance, a hymn that defied categorization. In 1936, the Federal Writers Project collected testimonies from formerly enslaved people before they passed away. Among the hundreds of interviews conducted was one with an elderly woman in Cleveland, Ohio, who had known Temperance in the last years of her life. The woman, recorded only as Aunt Bessie, offered a remarkable account. "Temperance, she told me once about the night she sang for the white folks. Said she didn't remember much of it herself. Said it was like something came over her, something came through her, and she was just the vessel. Said when she opened her mouth, it wasn't her voice that came out. It was every voice. Every voice of every person they ever stole from Africa, every person they ever worked to death in them fields, every child they ever sold away from its mama. She said she could feel them all crowding in, wanting to speak, wanting to be heard. And for that one night, she gave them a body to speak through." Aunt Bessie paused in the interview, her own voice cracking with emotion. I asked her once if she was scared that night. All them white folks staring at her and her just a little thing. She laughed, said, "Child, I was terrified. I thought they were going to kill me right there in that parlor, But the voice, it wasn't scared. The voice knew exactly what it was doing. I just had to trust it and let it lead. The interviewer asked if Temperance had ever explained what the hymn actually was, its structure, its lyrics, its meaning. Aunt Bessie shook her head. She couldn't explain it. Said it wasn't the kind of thing you could explain. Said it was the kind of thing that happens once and can never happen again the same way. Said every voice that was in her that night was also in everybody else, white folks included. Said the song didn't put something in them that wasn't there already. It just uncovered it. Made them see what they already knew but refused to look at. Made them feel what they already felt but refused to feel. The interview ended shortly after that, Aunt Bessie growing too tired to continue. She died 3 months later, taking with her another strand of the oral tradition. But the story persisted. Today, if you visit the site where Bellefleur Plantation once stood, you will find nothing but fields. The main house is gone, the slave quarters are gone. Even the oak trees that once lined the drive have been cut down for lumber. A historical marker, erected in 1998 after years of advocacy by local historians, stands at the entrance to the property. It mentions the Beaumont family. It mentions the plantation's economic importance to the antebellum Delta. It does not mention temperance. But on certain nights, if you listen carefully, old-timers say you can still hear something. Not a full song. The full song is gone, passed beyond retrieval into whatever realm music goes when its final performers have died. Just fragments, just echoes. A phrase of melody that seems to come from nowhere, that vibrates in your chest before it reaches your ears, that makes you feel, for just a moment, the weight of everything that happened on that ground. And sometimes, if you're in the right frame of mind, if you've let down your defenses and opened yourself to what the land is trying to say, you might feel something else. A presence. A voice. A young woman named Temperance, who found a way to make the silent speak, to make the powerful weep, to plant seeds of transformation that would take generations to flower. Her story is not finished. It cannot be finished. Because the truth she sang that night, about what human beings do to each other in the name of profit and power, about the self-deceptions we construct to avoid seeing our complicity, remains as urgent today as it was in 1847. The tears that fell in that parlor were not a solution. They were a beginning. A crack in the armor of indifference that had allowed slavery to flourish for centuries. Many of those who wept that night returned to their plantations and continued their lives as before, the moment of awakening fading into comfortable forgetfulness. But not all of them, and even those who forgot carried something with them, a splinter lodged beneath the skin of their conscience, working its way deeper with each passing year. Temperance understood this. She understood that a single song could not dismantle an institution. She understood that the work of transformation is slow, generational, often invisible. But she also understood something else, that silence is complicity, and that speaking truth, even when speaking seems hopeless, even when the audience seems unreachable, plants seeds whose harvest we may never live to see. In the final years of her life, Temperance was asked by a young minister what she wanted to be remembered for. She thought for a long time before answering. "I don't need to be remembered," she said. "The song needs to be remembered. Not the words, not the melody. Those were just vessels. What needs to be remembered is that it's possible, that a voice can reach places that fists and guns cannot reach, that the hardest hearts can be cracked open, if only for a moment. That moment is everything. That moment is where change begins." The minister asked if she had any regrets. "I regret that I couldn't save my mother," she said. "I regret that I couldn't save so many others. I regret every day I stayed silent before that night, and every day I stayed silent after. But the night itself? No. That night, I did what I was born to do. That night, I was exactly who I was supposed to be." She paused, looking out the window at the Ohio sky, so different from the Mississippi sky of her childhood, but somehow containing the same endless possibility. "And maybe," she added, "that's what freedom really means. Not the absence of chains, but the presence of purpose. Knowing who you are and having the courage to be that person, no matter what it costs. Temperance was buried in a small cemetery on the outskirts of Cleveland. Her grave was marked with a simple stone that bore her name and her dates, 1832-1891, and a single line of inscription she had chosen herself. I sang, and they heard. For decades, the grave was tended by members of her church community. Flowers appeared on the anniversary of her death. Children were brought to see the stone and told stories about the woman who had made slaveholders weep with nothing but her voice. But time passes, and memories fade, and by the mid-20th century, the cemetery had fallen into disrepair. The stone cracked. The inscription became difficult to read. The flowers stopped coming. Then, in 1978, a graduate student researching the oral traditions of enslaved communities stumbled upon references to temperance in the Federal Writers Project archives. She followed the trail of documents and testimonies, piecing together the story that had been scattered across generations. She found the cemetery. She found the grave. She raised money to restore the stone and clear the overgrowth. On the day the restoration was complete, a small crowd gathered: historians, descendants of the Cleveland Freed People community, a few curious locals who had heard about the project. Someone had brought a portable speaker, and as the sun began to set, they played recordings of old spirituals: Wade in the Water, Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, Amazing Grace. And then something happened that no one present could quite explain. During the final song, a woman in the crowd, a retired music teacher named Dorothy Williams, who claimed no special spiritual gifts and had attended the ceremony purely out of historical interest, began to hum. The hum became a melody. The melody became words. Words that Dorothy had never heard before, that seemed to rise from somewhere beneath her conscious mind, that matched the tempo of the recorded spirituals, but diverged into something stranger, older, more powerful. She sang for 3 minutes. When she stopped, she was trembling. "I don't know what that was," she said. "I don't know where it came from, but it felt like someone was singing through me." The crowd stood in stunned silence. Then slowly, one by one, they began to applaud. Not the polite applause of a concert audience, something rawer, something that acknowledged they had witnessed something they could not explain but knew to be real. Dorothy Williams never sang like that again. She never could explain what had happened. But she kept a photograph of Temperance's restored gravestone on her mantelpiece for the rest of her life, and when visitors asked about it, she would tell them the story of a young enslaved girl who had once made an entire room of slaveholders cry. "Her voice isn't gone," Dorothy would say. "It's just waiting for the right moment, the right person, the right ears that need to hear." What can we learn from Temperance's story? Perhaps only this: that the human spirit contains depths that no system of oppression can fully reach. That even in the darkest circumstances, there exists the possibility of speaking truth in ways that bypass the defenses we construct against it. That a single voice, in a single moment, can crack open hearts that seemed permanently sealed. The tears that fell in Adelaide Beaumont's parlor on that December night in 1847 did not end slavery. They did not bring back the millions who had already died. They did not reunite Temperance with her mother. By almost any measure, the hymn failed. But failure is not the only measure that matters. Sometimes the point is not to win, but to witness. Sometimes the point is not to change the world, but to remind the world that change is possible. Sometimes the point is simply to sing, to open your mouth and let whatever truth lives inside you find its way into the air, trusting that it will reach the ears that need to hear it. Temperance sang, and they heard. That is her legacy. That is her gift. That is the hymn that continues to echo down through the generations, waiting for the next voice brave enough to carry it forward. If the story of Temperance touched your heart, like this video so more people can discover her legacy. Share this so that her memory will never be forgotten. And if you watched until the very end, leave a comment saying, "I watched until here," so I know you're part of this community that believes in the power of hidden truths.